There are seasons in life when silence feels responsible. It looks like patience, maturity, discipline. You tell yourself you are being careful, protecting something, waiting for clarity. For a long time, that kind of silence feels like strength. It allows you to observe, to learn, to stay composed while others rush to speak. I lived inside that silence for years, believing restraint was wisdom. I believed saying less meant understanding more. And for a while, that belief served me well, because not every truth is meant to be spoken immediately, and not every moment requires a voice. Silence can be a shield. It can keep you safe from misunderstanding, from judgment, from saying something before you are ready to carry its consequences. I learned early that words change things. Once spoken, they cannot be returned to the quiet place they came from. So I learned to hold them. I learned to wait. I learned to let conversations end without adding what I really thought. That choice was not fear, it was control. But control, when held too long, slowly becomes a burden you forget you are carrying. Over time, I became skilled at silence. I could sit in rooms where expectations were heavy and remain steady. I could listen without reacting. I could nod without revealing what stayed unspoken inside me. People often mistake that for confidence, and sometimes it is. But sometimes it is simply endurance. The ability to tolerate weight without showing strain. The problem is not that silence exists. The problem is when silence becomes automatic. When it replaces honesty, even in moments that quietly ask for it. There is a moment, usually unannounced, when something shifts. You realize you are no longer being quiet to protect clarity. You are being quiet to avoid disruption. That is a subtle difference, but it matters. Because one comes from wisdom and the other comes from habit. I remember noticing that shift not as a thought, but as a feeling. A heaviness. A sense that holding back was costing more than it was preserving. That was the beginning of understanding why my silence had lasted so long. I stayed silent because silence gave me time. Time to observe patterns, to understand people beyond their words, to see how actions unfold without interference. Silence can be a powerful teacher. It reveals inconsistencies. It shows you what remains when no one is performing. For years, I trusted that approach. I believed that if something truly mattered, it would become obvious without my intervention. And often, that was true. But silence also teaches another lesson. One that takes longer to learn. Clarity without expression can become isolation. When you do not speak, people fill the space for you. They assign meaning. They assume understanding or indifference. Silence invites interpretation, and interpretation is rarely neutral. I accepted that for a long time, believing it was the cost of staying composed. But the longer I remained silent, the more I noticed a distance forming. Not dramatic, not obvious, just a quiet space between what I felt and what others knew. That space grew slowly, almost politely, until it became impossible to ignore without betraying myself. This is not a story about regret. I do not regret the years of listening, the patience, the restraint. Those years shaped my understanding. They taught me discernment. But every strength has a season. And when a strength outlives its season, it quietly turns into something else. Silence, once protective, can become a wall. Not to keep danger out, but to keep truth in. That realization did not arrive loudly. It arrived as calm certainty. The kind that does not demand action, but makes inaction feel dishonest. I began to understand that staying silent was no longer neutral. It was a decision, whether I admitted it or not. A decision to prioritize comfort over clarity, to avoid discomfort rather than risk honesty. That realization was unsettling, not because it forced immediate change, but because it removed the illusion of innocence. Once you see that silence is a choice, you are responsible for what it withholds. And responsibility has a way of sharpening awareness. It asks you to consider not just what you avoid saying, but why you avoid it. Silence kept me safe, but it also kept me unseen. And there is a quiet cost to being unseen for too long. You begin to feel as though your inner world exists in isolation, untouched and unacknowledged. That is not loneliness in the obvious sense. It is subtler. It is the absence of resonance, the absence of having your inner truth reflected back to you. I did not notice this absence immediately. It accumulated slowly, like weight added in small increments, until clarity demanded attention. This is why I stayed silent for years. Not because I had nothing to say, but because silence once felt like the most responsible language I had. It gave me control, perspective, and time. But time changes context. What protects you at one stage can confine you at another. And eventually, silence stops being thoughtful and starts being heavy. That is the moment this story begins. Not with words spoken, but with the realization that continuing to hold them would mean turning away from myself. And that, finally, felt like the greater risk. Tonight, I'm not breaking that silence yet. I am simply acknowledging it. Naming it without urgency, without drama, without demand. Because before words are released, they must be understood. And before understanding is shared, it must be owned. This moment is not about confession or resolution. It is about awareness. The quiet kind that settles in when the day ends and distractions fall away. The kind that prepares you to speak later, not louder, but truer, with intention rather than impulse, and with respect for everything silence once taught you. It reminds you that growth often begins quietly, long before anyone else hears what finally needs to be said aloud later on. Silence does not disappear all at once. It thins first. It becomes more selective. You start noticing the moments when it no longer fits, when holding back feels less like patience and more like avoidance. That is where this section begins, not with speech, but with awareness. Because before someone learns how to speak honestly, they must understand why they have been quiet. For me, that understanding arrives slowly, through observation rather than emotion, through calm recognition rather than urgency. I began to see that my silence had rules. I spoke freely about ideas, about work, about concepts that stayed safely abstract. But when conversations drifted toward meaning, toward intention, toward what actually mattered beneath the surface, I retreated. Not because I lacked clarity, but because clarity carries responsibility. Once you express what matters, you invite response, and response introduces uncertainty. Silence avoids that. It keeps things unresolved but stable. And stability, even when incomplete, can feel reassuring. Over time, I noticed how often I chose that reassurance. How often I let moments pass because they felt easier untouched. The choice was rarely dramatic. It showed up in small decisions. A thought left unspoken. A truth delayed. An emotion acknowledged internally but never voiced. Each time it felt reasonable. Each time it felt controlled. But accumulation changes meaning. What begins as discretion becomes habit, and habit becomes identity if left unexamined. There is a quiet cost to that identity. When you become known as someone who is measured, reserved, always composed, people stop expecting honesty from you. They expect stability, predictability. They expect you to remain the same regardless of what shifts underneath. That expectation is subtle, but it shapes how others relate to you. They listen less closely. They assume you are unaffected. And when that happens, silence is no longer neutral. It becomes a role you are expected to play. I realized then that part of my silence was no longer for me. It was for others. It was maintaining an image of steadiness that felt easier than disrupting assumptions. That realization did not bring guilt. It brought clarity. Because once you see that your restraint serves expectations rather than truth, you have to decide whether those expectations deserve your continued compliance. That decision does not require immediate action. It requires honesty with yourself first. I began asking different questions. Not, is this the right time to speak? But what happens if I don't? Not, will this create discomfort? But what am I protecting by staying quiet? Those questions changed the tone of my silence. It was no longer passive. It became intentional, and intention has a way of exposing motivations. I could see clearly when silence was still wise, and when it was simply familiar. What surprised me most was how little drama accompanied this shift. There was no emotional surge, no urgency to correct the past. Just a calm understanding that some truths were waiting, not because they were fragile, but because I needed to become someone capable of expressing them without force. Silence had given me time to mature emotionally, to understand myself without external validation. But maturity also asks for expression. It asks for presence, not just observation. I noticed that the moments urging me to speak were not loud. They did not demand attention. They appeared in quiet exchanges, in simple conversations where something honest wanted to surface. The urge to speak did not come from frustration. It came from alignment, a sense that withholding no longer matched who I had become. That is an important distinction. Speaking from alignment feels calm. Speaking from reaction feels sharp. I was not interested in sharpness. I was interested in truth that could stand without tension. There is a particular kind of courage required to shift from silence to honesty. Not the courage to confront, but the courage to be seen accurately. Silence allows people to project whatever they need onto you. Honesty corrects those projections. And correction can feel risky even when done gently. But the risk is quieter than expected. Often, the greater risk is remaining unseen, unrecognized, and ultimately disconnected from your own voice. I stayed silent for years because silence once felt like integrity. It felt like restraint, like respect for complexity. And that was true. But integrity evolves. What is honest at one stage can become incomplete at another. Growth does not demand abandonment of past strengths. It asks for integration. Silence does not need to be discarded. It needs to be balanced with truth. The challenge is recognizing when that balance has shifted. As this awareness settled, I felt no rush to change how others perceived me. I felt no need to correct assumptions immediately. This was an internal adjustment first, a quiet recalibration. I allowed myself to acknowledge what I wanted to say without yet saying it. That acknowledgement mattered. It was the first step out of automatic silence and into conscious presence. Not speech yet. Presence. Presence changes how silence feels. It removes the heaviness. Silence becomes choice again, not default. And when silence is chosen consciously, it regains its strength. It becomes spacious rather than restrictive. From that place, speech can emerge naturally, without pressure, without performance. That is the space I found myself entering. Not ready to speak everything, but no longer hiding from the possibility. This section is not about breaking silence. It is about understanding it. Understanding why it existed, why it lasted, and why it began to loosen. Because speech that comes without understanding simply replaces one imbalance with another. I was not interested in replacing silence with noise. I was interested in allowing truth to have a place alongside restraint. That balance takes time. It takes patience. It takes respect for everything silence once protected. Silence taught me how to listen. Now it was teaching me how to prepare to speak. Not impulsively, not dramatically, but with clarity and calm confidence. The kind that does not need validation. The kind that can wait until words are ready to carry their own weight. That readiness does not announce itself. It settles quietly like an understanding you no longer argue with. And once it settles, silence is no longer a refuge. It becomes a doorway. There is a subtle shift that happens when you start to understand silence not just as a shield, but as a precursor to clarity. It is a quiet realization that your voice has been waiting. Not because it was suppressed, but because it needed to learn patience. The words you have held for years are not frustrated thoughts. They are tempered truths. They have been sitting in a space carved out by restraint, waiting for a moment when speaking them aligns not only with intention, but with presence. That alignment is rare, but when it comes, it feels natural rather than forced. It is not about dramatic confession or sudden revelation. It is about the calm acknowledgement that what has been held quietly can now be expressed thoughtfully, responsibly, and with authenticity. In those years of silence, I learned to observe the spaces between words, how much can be communicated without sound. There is power in restraint, in noticing the subtleties of interaction, in sensing what is left unsaid and understanding its weight. Often, the most significant truths are not shouted into rooms. They are recognized in glances, in pauses, in the unspoken agreements between people who understand each other without needing explanation. That kind of understanding, built slowly over time, became the foundation for the words I had withheld. I understood that when the time came to speak, those words would carry not only meaning but the depth of experience behind them. I realized that my silence had also been a mirror, reflecting back to me the parts of myself I had avoided seeing. When no one else hears you, you are forced to listen to yourself. That is where self-awareness grows. It is quiet work, and it is often uncomfortable because it reveals both strength and limitation. I learned how much of my restraint had been motivated not by wisdom alone, but by fear of misunderstanding or rejection. That recognition was not a moment of shame, it was clarity. And clarity, when embraced without judgment, prepares the way for genuine expression. Patience is different from avoidance. Silence can be either, depending on intention. Patience respects timing. Avoidance denies it. The difference lies in awareness. Once I recognized that some of my silence was avoidance masquerading as patience, I knew it was time to reconsider how I engaged with the world. Not immediately, not recklessly, but intentionally. I allowed myself to observe the moments that quietly demanded my voice, the spaces where truth had been waiting patiently for acknowledgement. This was not impulsive courage, it was disciplined honesty, the kind that does not demand attention, but earns it simply by existing. There is also a relationship between silence and intimacy. Many people avoid honest speech because they fear vulnerability. I understood early that intimacy requires both. Silence can protect, but it can also isolate. Speaking truthfully can bridge the distance silence creates, but only if the words come from awareness rather than reaction. I started to notice that the moments that called for expression were not always dramatic. Often they were subtle cues, an unspoken question in someone's eyes, the gentle weight of expectation, or the quiet longing for acknowledgement. When observed carefully, these moments reveal not only the other person's need, but your own readiness to respond authentically. I had also discovered that speech, like silence, requires intention. Words carry energy. They can heal, clarify, and connect, or they can mislead, distract, or overwhelm. That understanding kept me restrained for years, but it also prepared me to speak with precision and care. Now, as I considered what had remained unspoken, I began to sense how each word, carefully chosen, could convey far more than a stream of hurried sentences. Each word was a reflection of experience, a marker of presence, a testament to both patience and courage. Listening to oneself is a prerequisite for speaking to others. It is tempting to believe that clarity comes from observation alone, but observation is incomplete without introspection. Silence is only valuable if it deepens understanding. Otherwise, it becomes a barrier. I spent years listening, not just to others, but to my own motivations, fears, and desires. That process revealed patterns I had previously ignored, tendencies to retreat, habits of deflection, and moments where honesty had been sacrificed for convenience. Recognizing these patterns was not an exercise in criticism, but in preparation. Preparedness is the quiet strength behind deliberate speech. I also realized that expressing what has been held quietly does not have to be loud or performative. True honesty does not demand drama. It requires calm and steadiness. When you speak from this place, the words themselves carry weight without the need for embellishment. They do not compete for attention. They settle in the listener's awareness naturally. That understanding changed the way I approached conversations. The goal was no longer to impress, persuade, or control, it was to align. Alignment is subtle but powerful. It is the bridge between restraint and presence. Between observation and participation, what I had withheld for years was not trivial. It was truth wrapped in experience, tempered by reflection and strengthened by patience. The silence had allowed it to mature, to shed the unnecessary layers of reaction, and to gain clarity. Speaking it now required no justification, no apology. It simply required acknowledgement, a willingness to place words into the world that were fully owned. That ownership is the difference between expression and performance. One is authentic. The other is imitation. I wanted authenticity. Finally, I understood that this journey from silence to intentional speech is not linear. There are moments when silence is still appropriate, moments when listening is still the wiser choice. But the key difference is awareness. Each decision to speak or remain quiet must now be informed by intention, by clarity, and by respect for both self and others. I realized that holding words indefinitely is no longer a sign of wisdom. It is a missed opportunity for connection, for truth, and for presence. With that understanding, I could step into expression not as a reaction, but as a conscious choice. The essence of this section is this: silence taught me patience, observation, and self-awareness. It also taught me responsibility, the understanding that words, when finally spoken, carry the weight of experience behind them. And in that weight lies power. Not power to control, not power to impress, but power to connect, to resonate, and to be truly present. That is the subtle, quiet, transformative energy that emerges when one has learned not only to hold back, but to release thoughtfully. Transitioning from years of silence to intentional speech is not sudden. It is a gentle unfolding, a shift in awareness that gradually alters the way you inhabit both your inner world and your relationships. Silence, when held consciously, teaches restraint, clarity, and patience. But when it persists beyond its usefulness, it can obscure connection and diminish presence. I realized this quietly over time in moments that were almost imperceptible when a glance, a gesture, or a subtle tension revealed that my unspoken words were being missed, misinterpreted, or longed for. Those moments did not demand immediate action. They demanded reflection. Reflection became the compass guiding my emerging voice. I began to ask myself not only what had been withheld, but why. Which parts of my silence were protective and which were habitual? Which words were postponed for wisdom and which for avoidance? That discernment was essential. Because once you recognize the distinction, you reclaim ownership of your expression. You no longer speak impulsively, nor do you remain muted out of habit. Instead, you operate with intention. That intention carries a quiet authority, one that does not demand attention but naturally earns it. There is a kind of honesty that arises only after sustained silence. It is not dramatic, not performative, and not reactive. It is measured, composed, and deeply grounded. I noticed this honesty emerging in subtle ways through careful phrasing, through attention to tone, through timing that respected both the listener and myself. Every word became a reflection of experience rather than a tool for persuasion. That realization altered my perspective. Speech was no longer a risk. It was an opportunity to share truth without compromising calm, dignity, or clarity. I began to recognize that my silence had protected me, yes, but it had also delayed growth. Silence allows observation, but it cannot replace engagement. The lessons I had learned in quiet observation needed application. Without expression, knowledge remains theoretical. Without connection, insight remains isolated. There is a difference between learning in solitude and contributing from presence, and understanding that difference is transformative. It is the subtle moment when you stop measuring yourself by what you withhold and begin considering. The impact of what you share. Part of this transformation involved reassessing relationships, both personal and professional. Silence, when habitual, creates distance. Others fill that distance with assumptions, and assumptions often miss the mark. I realized that by holding back, I had unintentionally shaped perceptions of me that were incomplete. That insight did not bring guilt, only awareness. Awareness invited responsibility, the responsibility to bridge gaps that had formed quietly over time, to allow connection where only observation had existed, to honor my own truth alongside that of others. Speaking intentionally after years of silence also requires courage, though not of the obvious kind. It is not about confrontation or dramatic revelation. It is the courage to be accurate, authentic, and measured. It is the courage to reveal what has been learned in quiet contemplation, trusting that clarity will carry the weight it needs to. And it is a quiet courage, often unnoticed, because it does not demand applause or validation. Its power lies in its subtlety, in the alignment of thought, intention, and voice, I noticed the impact of this subtle courage in small ways. When I finally began sharing my perspective, conversations shifted. They became less about assumptions and more about understanding. People listened differently not because the words were extraordinary, but because they were grounded in presence. That presence signals something more profound than content. It signals reliability, authenticity, and the maturity that comes from patience. Words matter, but timing, tone, and intention matter even more. There's also a lesson in patience embedded within speech itself. Having withheld words for years, I could no longer rush them. I had learned to allow meaning to emerge at its own pace, to give each idea room to breathe before being placed into conversation. That patience was an extension of silence discipline applied to expression rather than suppression. And it changed everything. The words became stronger because they were selected deliberately, spoken with calm precision and grounded in reflection. As this phase of emergence continued, I realized that speaking truth after long silence is not only about clarity with others, it is about reconciliation with yourself. Every word carries a fragment of your inner experience, a reminder of what has been held and considered. By articulating it, you acknowledge your own presence in a space that has sometimes felt indifferent, fleeting, or dismissive. There is liberation in that acknowledgement. It is the quiet triumph of recognition, of honoring both the lessons of restraint and the value of expression. I also began to understand that not all truths need to be shared immediately. Timing remains essential. Speaking prematurely can dilute meaning. Speaking without alignment can fracture connection. The balance between silence and speech is ongoing, a practice of mindfulness, awareness, and presence. My experience taught me that the most effective expression emerges not from impulse but from observation, reflection, and respect for the rhythms of interaction. This is not strategic manipulation, it is emotional clarity applied thoughtfully. Finally, I recognized that what I had learned could be extended to others. Silence teaches empathy. It teaches listening. It teaches respect for the pace at which others process truth. And when combined with intentional speech, it creates a rare form of communication, one that is both grounded and connective, quiet yet powerful, measured yet impactful. That is the gift of moving from silence to speech. It is not simply a change in volume, it is the evolution of presence itself. In essence, this section captures the transition from habitual restraint to deliberate expression. It is the moment when observation begins to intersect with engagement, when understanding evolves into contribution. It is not about dramatizing the change, but about respecting it. The silence that once shaped me now informs the words I choose, ensuring that they carry both authenticity and impact. That I have learned is the true power of patience, reflection, and emotional maturity. By the time I reached this stage, I understood that speaking after long silence is not merely about the words themselves. It is about the energy behind them, the calm, grounded presence that gives them weight without demanding attention. There is a subtle difference between saying something and allowing it to be received. The latter requires patience and trust. Patience with yourself, trust in your clarity, and faith that honesty will find its proper place. That understanding reshapes the act of speaking from an obligation into an offering. It is no longer reactive, no longer urgent. It is deliberate, considered, and emotionally rooted. I began noticing the subtle power of observation in these interactions. Silence had trained me to see what often goes unnoticed, the small cues, the unspoken questions, the moments when someone longs to be heard. In learning to listen without interjecting, I had gained insight into the rhythms of communication that most people overlook. Words, when finally spoken, became more than statements, they became bridges. They connected not just ideas, but understanding, intention, and mutual recognition. That is the quiet impact of truth spoken with care. Long silence also brings a heightened awareness of timing. There is a natural rhythm to conversations, an ebb and flow that cannot be rushed without compromising clarity. Years of restraint had trained me to recognize when a space was ready for honesty and when it still required patience. Speaking too early often dilutes meaning. Speaking too late risks irrelevance. Learning to navigate this delicate timing is an art informed by both empathy and self-awareness. It is not about control, it is about harmony. I discovered that expressing truth after years of silence demands trust, not only in others but in yourself. You must trust that the words you have refined internally will land with the precision they carry. You must trust that your intent will resonate even without embellishment. And most importantly, you must trust that withholding unnecessarily has not diminished your voice, but rather strengthened it. Each carefully chosen word embodies the lessons of observation, reflection, and emotional patience. That is what allows communication to be both gentle and powerful. There is also a subtle humility in speaking after silence. You learn that your words are not the only ones that matter, nor are they the solution to every misunderstanding. They are a contribution, a reflection of your inner state, and a representation of your presence in the moment. This understanding removes the need for performance or validation. It allows the words to exist authentically without overcompensation. In this space, honesty is not a tool for influence, it is a mirror of alignment. Both within yourself and in your relationship with others, I noticed the way others began to respond differently when I spoke with intention. It was not that my words were extraordinary. It was that they were grounded. They carried the subtle weight of someone who had listened deeply, reflected patiently, and spoken deliberately. People do not respond to volume. They respond to authenticity. And after years of measured silence, I had cultivated the kind of authenticity that does not need applause or acknowledgement. It simply resonates. The final stage of this journey is integration, the delicate balance between silence and speech, between reflection and expression. After years of careful listening and observation, I understood that words, when finally spoken, are most powerful when they emerge from a place of presence, patience, and clarity. Silence had been my teacher, shaping my understanding of timing, intention, and the weight of words. Now, speech became the natural extension of that learning, a continuation, not a disruption of the wisdom accumulated over time. I noticed that this integration required both courage and humility. Courage because expressing oneself after long silence carries vulnerability. Every word risks being misinterpreted, dismissed, or overlooked. Humility because expression alone does not guarantee understanding, connection, or agreement. Together, courage and humility form the foundation of authenticity. They allow words to exist not as tools of influence or performance, but as reflections of truth grounded in experience and self-awareness. One of the most profound lessons in this process is that patience does not end with speech. Speaking intentionally requires listening even as you speak. It requires attending to responses, adjusting with care, and maintaining awareness of the dynamic flow of interaction. This is not strategic manipulation. It is emotional attentiveness. The act of expressing oneself becomes an ongoing dialogue, one where silence and speech coexist harmoniously. The moments between words, the pauses, and the quiet acknowledgement of space all carry meaning as powerful as the words themselves. I also realized that intentional speech strengthens relationships in ways that silence alone cannot. When words are thoughtfully shared, they provide clarity, reduce assumptions, and invite genuine connection. Silence teaches observation, but connection requires participation. I found that the words I had withheld for years were not lost, they were refined. When shared, they carried not only information, but resonance, presence, and an authenticity that could not have existed without the patience cultivated in prior restraint. This stage also revealed the importance of self-trust. Speaking after long silence is meaningful only when the voice is confident in its value. Trust is built through the years of listening, reflection, and measured engagement. That trust allows expression without defensiveness, without the need for external validation. It allows words to land naturally, to resonate quietly, and to be absorbed by others without force or urgency. The listener senses that presence, and it fosters a subtle but deep connection. I began to understand that this integration is iterative. Silence and speech are not opposing forces, they are complementary. Each informs the other. Silence without eventual expression can stagnate insight, while speech without the grounding of reflection can become noise. The harmony of these two states is a continuous practice. Each conversation, each choice to withhold or speak, is an opportunity to refine presence, to cultivate awareness, and to engage authentically with the world. In integrating silence and speech, I discovered a profound sense of alignment. Words became not just a reflection of thought, but a manifestation of the internal growth that silence had nurtured. There was a quiet satisfaction in this balance, a sense that expression no longer competed with restraint, but honored it. I could speak with intention, listen with patience, and move through life with calm confidence, knowing that both silence and speech served their purpose at the right time. What emerged from this integration was more than communication. It was emotional maturity embodied. The ability to navigate life's conversations with authenticity, clarity, and presence is a rare skill. It is cultivated over years, often quietly, through reflection, restraint, and observation. And when it is finally expressed, it carries a resonance that can transform ordinary interaction into meaningful connection. That is the subtle power of presence, the gift of having learned to wait, to listen, and to speak with intention. I also recognize that this balance enriches not only my interactions with others, but my relationship with myself. Silence allowed me to understand my fears, desires, and motivations. Speech allows me to acknowledge and integrate that understanding externally. Together, they create a feedback loop of awareness, growth, and authenticity. Each word spoken with this awareness reinforces self-trust, emotional clarity, and the capacity for meaningful engagement. Finally, I realized that the culmination of these years of silence and emerging speech is not closure but ongoing evolution. Life will continue to present moments where silence is necessary, where speech is required, and where careful discernment guides the choice between the two. The lessons are enduring, that restraint can strengthen expression, that presence amplifies clarity, and that authenticity arises when patience, courage, and awareness coexist. In this understanding, I found not only freedom, but responsibility, the freedom to be fully present, and the responsibility to honor the space that both silence and speech create. This section, the final one, captures the integration of all the lessons from years of intentional silence and patient observation. It is the quiet power of deliberate speech, the presence that carries insight, and the harmony of restraint and expression. The journey from silence to voice is complete not in a single act, but in a practiced alignment with truth, patience, and authenticity. That is the culmination of growth, the reward of reflection, and the quiet strength that emerges when one has learned to inhabit both silence and speech with grace.